everybody who came today in the not so wonderful weather and the busy time of the season because everybody's getting ready for Thanksgiving, etc., etc. And thank you for those of you who came down our stairs because I am trying to get that elevator fixed. And they're just not listening. Even the state inspector, I've even got the state inspector and it still hasn't happened. But they promised on the 5th of December they would be here. So we'll see if that happens. So thank you for bearing with us for that. Just a couple quick announcements. We got calls today from Ray Scott, who was going to come and couldn't make it, and he said to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. We got a call from Rosie Noonan today. So many of you will remember Rosie. She's in a care center in Dubuque, and she wanted to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving as well. And we have a birthday card going around for Laurel Williams. Okay, announcements. So we have action in our back 40 out here, if you notice. They're beginning to build the additional shed. Right now we're calling it the Clinton Engine Annex. You'll be hearing more about that later. And we're working away at now what we're calling the Clinton Engine Warehouse, which we called the chicken farm for a while. That didn't work very well. So you're going to see a lot of things happening there. Wanted to let you know that Brown Bag Lunch next Tuesday, which will be December 2nd, is going to be given by Sue Mayberry. I think you're going to really enjoy it. She's going to be talking about people from Jackson County who worked at the different railroads throughout the years. And some of their stories and their experiences, because you remember how important railroads were here not that long ago. And then on the 9th, Ray Scott will be here. That's the day of our big soup supper. Ray Scott will be giving the program that day. He's going to be talking about dairies and all the little dairies that were around Jackson County. There were a couple right kind of within Maquoketa. Not creameries, but dairies. So that's what he'll be talking about. And he's a perfect person to do it because he's been a dairy farmer in Wisconsin for a very long time, but he's basically from here. Okay, so don't forget, on Tuesday, December 9th, will be our holiday soup supper and cookie walk. It'll start out with the brown bag lunch that we just talked about by Ray Scott. And then when that's over at 1 o'clock, the doors will open back there and the cookie walk will begin. We have awesome bakers here, and there'll be homemade cookies and candies and all kinds of holiday treats. And they'll be for sale by the pound. And so that's our kind of our fundraiser. There'll be a silent auction up here. That'll begin at that time too. And then from 4:30 to 6:30 will be the soup supper. We always have 4 kinds of soup. We always have homemade chili, Jack Willie's, vegetable meat barley soup, chicken noodle soup, and then our special soup this year is going to be cheesy potato soup. We have one that rotates. So please be sure and come to that. So we're going to close the museum then from the 24th to the 6th of January, I believe, for the Thanksgiving holiday. So, with that being said, welcome to Brown Bag Lunch. I'm glad that you're all here. We're going to be talking today, as you can see, a little bit about the Ellisonian and the Ellis museums and some of the things that have been happening around here relative to that. I want to remind everybody before we start, the reason that we do Brown Bag Lunch is so people can weigh in. Everybody knows things. And we're looking for the better answer. We're looking for corrections to the information we have and additions. So if you know anything about this subject, please, just raise your hand. And it's all about getting the information gathered together. That's kind of what Brown Bag Lunches are for. So hopefully some of you were able to attend the wonderful program that we had at the museum. It was in late September, maybe the 30th, something like that, about the Seeberger Cave. And we even have members of the Seeberger family that never heard of the Seeberger Cave before. But it's just a wonderful story. And the program was given by Bill Green, who a lot of you got to meet. Bill Green is the former state archaeologist of Iowa. He, until recently, was director of the Logan Museum of Anthropology, which plays a big part in the Seeberger Cave. And so he came and he did this He did this wonderful program for us, and we all learned a lot, I know. So this is a picture of the Seeberger Cave, and from this picture, perhaps it doesn't look too big, but I'm told that cattle can walk right in there. Is that true?
Yeah.
So this cave is large enough so that cattle can just walk in and out. So that makes it pretty big in my mind. So this was a picture that was taken in 2023, I think, when they came to reinvestigate this cave, and they worked with the museum doing that, and they just did a lot of research. So maybe that's a little better picture, right? With the people standing in front, it gives you a little bit of perspective about how big the entrance to this cave was. And there in the hole, you see Bill Green, and he's just a really fun person to know. And he's written his study now. He's got his study done, and we were able to get his book that's there on the table that he's published about the study that he did. So he has contacted us. He's in constant contact with us because he wants everybody around here to know that the story of the discovery of the things that were in this cave and the information that it's going to give us isn't over. That this is, what he's done is just kind of the first phase, even though it began over 100 years ago, but that there's still a lot of information around here to be gleaned, and that he'd like everybody to, to be a part of that. And so that's what we're going to be trying to do. So this big cave is in Farmers Creek Township, right? Farmers Creek Township, out near Fulton, okay? And it was excavated 99 years ago by a young man by the name of Paul Nesbitt, and there he is. He was an archaeologist from the Logan Museum, and he came here and he excavated the cave, and the artifacts were all collected, and they were packed up and they were shipped back to Beloit, Wisconsin. But once they got there, they were never curated, they were never studied, they just kind of sat there until Bill Green retired from being the state archaeologist, and he went to Beloit, Wisconsin, and he took over the Logan Museum of Anthropology, maybe it was called. And so he was the one that curated this collection and then wrote this fine book. It's a scientific study about what he found there. So we know that an important player in this is Frank Ellis, who's the other man in the picture there. Frank Ellis and his son, he has told us in some of the news clippings that we have, they spent 3 years excavating what they called a very large cave in Jackson County. But we don't know for sure, I don't think, whether it was the same cave or not. I don't think we have, outside of Macocody Cave State Park, that many really large caves. So I think that the cave that we're talking about is one of the largest. So it seems probable to me that he was excavating the same cave 3 years before this study happened. And Bill Green is very interested in figuring out that possibility. And he'd like to know the things that were taken out of that cave earlier. In the 3 years that Frank Ellis perhaps was there taking things out, where did they go, and where are they, and what can we learn from them? So he's asked us to research, find all the information we can possibly find. Kathy Bailey did an amazing job. We have scores of articles that she copied and got ready for him, and we sent off to him, and he'll be able to study these and hopefully pick out things that won't maybe make sense to us, but maybe there'll be an important piece of the puzzle that he's trying to put together. And so we're studying the Ellis collections, and we are really honored to be asked to help to do his research again. So that's kind of where we are, and like I say, he's really anxious for any information that we can find. So any of you who have memories of the Ellisonian Museum, which was gone long before we were here, I think, but the Ellis Museum was not. And so some of you might remember your parents talking about this museum and some of the things that were in there. So maybe the best thing to do is to start at the beginning. So this is J.W. Ellis that we've all heard about. He wrote the famous 1910 Jackson County history books, 2 volumes, called the Ellis, we call them the Ellis Histories. He wrote those. And so he was just very involved in all of this. His name was really James Whitcomb, and he actually founded the Jackson County Historical Society many years ago. And from his own pen, we have the articles that he wrote for the society. There were 7 booklets called the Annals of Jackson County, and in those he told us a little bit about himself to talk about. You can see there some of the things that he did. These were his parents. His father was Jesse Ellis. He grew up in Kentucky on a farm. Came to Jackson County in 1852, which was pretty early for us. Jesse bought 160 acres of land in South Fork Township, where he lived until he died in 1889. So that was right near Hurstville, in the Hurstville area. And I found it hard to believe, but at that time, there were more families in the Hurstville area in 1905 than there are in 2025. There were a lot of people in that area. So when they came here, J.W. Ellis was only 4 years old. But he grew up in this area that for so long had been the home of a lot of Indian tribes that traveled through here. J.W. Ellis attended country school until he was 14, and 4 different times he tried to enlist in the Civil War. He finally made it when he was 16 years old, and we're told that he was in campaigns from Culpeper to Petersburg, but finally he was made to come home by his parents because of his age. Later he enlisted for service on the frontier again against the Indians, and according to the portrait and biographical album of Jackson County, where you write your own story and put it in, what is said about is he served the last 3 years under the leadership of the heroic and ill-fated General George Custer. Though so young, his coolness and daring in the face of danger attracted the favorable attention of his brave commander, who twice promoted him and recommended him warmly for a commission. So that was some of his military service. There's his wife. He came home to the family farm where he lived. He began buying land and cutting off timber and selling the timber. He conducted a growing fire insurance business, and in 1907 he actually moved into Maquoketa. He had married Mary Forbes in 1870, and she was a daughter of early pioneers, and they had 9 children. And she worked along with him to do the Old Settlers Society, and just very involved in everything, and she passed away in 1907. But they had a huge family, as you can see there. So when they moved to town, and I don't know where that was taken, but when they moved to town, they lived on the corner of Otto and Pleasant Street. And I'm sure you've heard Don Wentworth tell the story of the alligator. He tells the story of the alligator often. The alligator's name was Samson, and his grandson James kept it in the basement of the house on the corner of Otto and Pleasant. And it was an alligator that was sent to the Ellisonian Museum, because remember, he called that the Museum of Oddities and Curiosities. And he got a lot of pretty interesting but pretty strange things that people would send him. But this alligator named Samson used to get out occasionally, and there are stories, even in our histories, of how it used to walk up and down Main Street. And people were used to seeing it. They just kind of knew to keep their distance, because I understand it was quite large. And when Samson finally died, he was buried in the basement of that house. And the house is just still standing right down here. We do know that there was a kitchen fire there once, because we have some artifacts that survived the fire. When J.W. Ellis, after he had passed away and his family was living there, etc., they brought to the Historical Society the wooden prints. I don't know if they're called prints or plates. They're the little wooden blocks that they used to use to make pictures in the books. And so they brought to the museum all of the wooden blocks that made the wonderful pictures that are in the 1910 history, and they are really, really nice pictures. But you can see that the wood is singed around them, and they were in the kitchen when that kitchen caught on fire. Jessie Albright, his daughter, lived there, and then because in 2010 we celebrated the 100th anniversary of this history book that he wrote, we knew his grandchildren that lived in California, Richard and Ramona. So we've had some contact with his family. J.W. Ellis was quite an individual himself. He was a justice of the peace, president of the Southport Township School Board for over 20 years. He was always interested in education as well as things military. He served on the Soldiers Relief Commission, was a commander of the A.W. Drips Post, GAR. He commanded the Union Veterans, the Iowa Union Veterans Union, and he was honored with the second highest office in that organization, and it was a national command of that order. So he was just very accomplished, okay? One of the great things that he did was he organized the homecoming of 1907, they called it, and he contacted people who had lived here years earlier, and he got all kinds of people to come back to Maquoketa and celebrate at this time. He started the Historical Society. Like I said, he was the secretary, he was the curator, and one of his greatest accomplishments, however, was this homecoming, and there's so much written about that. Brought hundreds of people back to Maquoketa who had lived here previously. He was, as was evidently 4 generations of his family before and after, a member of the Iowa House of Representatives from 1909 to 1913. He built the Ellis block, which you'll recognize from downtown Maquoketa, that's still standing there. Where the pizza place is, right? The building's going south of that. But perhaps his most famous and most unusual accomplishment is that he established the Ellisonian Museum. Okay? So this was a building on Pleasant Street. Everybody remembers Dr. Ellis, all of the Ellis dentists that were in town. And the Ellis Museum was on the 2nd floor of that for some time. And there's another picture of it. One of those, if you blow it up, you can see that it says Ellisonian Museum across the front. So he called this museum the Ellisonian Institute, a collection of oddities and curiosities. And he talks about it again in the 1910 history book. And he gives us a look at maybe a little bit of what it contained. Some pretty interesting things. He had sharpened heads that were sent to him by American soldiers that were serving in the West Indies and the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. But he collected firearms, lots and lots of firearms. And they're said to be he was said to have had at that time one of the best collections maybe in the entire world. He had weapons from the Revolutionary War, the Napoleonic Wars, and every war since. He had fossilized specimens of animals and plant life, costumes, weapons from all different lands, implements of industry, just almost everything that you could imagine. Autographs, autographed letters from famous people. And it's said of him that it seems hardly possible that within his lifetime, one man, without making it his business, because remember he had an insurance business, he was a farmer, etc., should have brought together such a splendid collection. And it was Mr. Ellis's purpose to someday make this a gift to Maquoketa or to the county. Okay? You see there the tickets that they had. This one, the Ellisonian Museum, that's the early one, and if you can read that and look closely, it lists his son Charles Ellis as the proprietor, and Dr. L.L. Riggs as the manager. We know Dr. Riggs was very famous around here. He did a lot of things before he went to medical school and became quite a famed doctor. But if you look at the second ticket, it says Ellis Museum. And that's because when he passed away, his son, Frank Ellis, started his own museum and moved a lot of his father's collection into that. So they were 2 separate things. His, maybe some oddities and curiosities, but the Ellis Museum was much more serious. He had many Native American artifacts. He had wonderful weapons and things like that, and people from everywhere came to see. If you look at this second ticket, okay, from the Ellis Museum, you can see that the Seeberger Cave, for instance, was excavated in 1926. 100 years ago next year, that was excavated. Everything they took out of there, every artifact that they took out of there was crated up and it went to Beloit, Wisconsin. But we know that Frank Ellis and his son were in that cave digging, taking things out, removing things for 3 years before that. So those things would have all gone to the Ellisonian Museum because his Ellis Museum had not been built yet. J.W. Ellis didn't die until 1929, and he ran his museum right up to the end. So anything taken from there would have been taken to the Ellisonian Museum. So that's why the Ellisonian Museum is of such interest to Bill Green and the people that are still researching the Seeberger Cave. After he died, after J.W. died, his son built the Ellis Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, so it was right next to, just north of, the Maquoketa Library. And you can see the library right there, before it was added on to, right? So now I assume that this is where the new addition to the library would be?
Yes.
Okay, so that's where this was. Like I say, much more serious items, weapons, Native American artifacts, that sort of thing. No shrunken heads, no oddities, and no curiosities. Okay. About that time, Frank Ellis also died, and upon his death, his son Francis took over the museum. Francis, even though everything was promised by his father and his grandfather to have stayed in Maquoketa or Jackson County, Francis evidently wanted no part of it, and he offered it for sale, all or nothing. And he did offer it to the Historical Society for $2,000. And I really have mixed emotions about that, knowing what was in there. But it was at a time, and it was at a time when there was no money. They had no building. They had no place to put anything. And so what do you do with this huge, huge collection of things? The Historical Society didn't move into the Pearson building, the museum at the Pearson building, until the next year. They didn't really know for sure that that was coming. And so, sadly, they just let that go. I just can't imagine why they could have had a bake sale or something and bought that stuff for $2,000. Realizing that $2,000 was a lot more money then than it is now, right? I remember Lucille Sorensen, and many of you remember Lucille Sorensen. She was always at the museum, and she talked about visiting Francis, who owned everything at the end, and trying to get certain pieces of the collection for the museum. They chose a group of local citizens: Melvin Joyner, Mary Shriver, Richard Sorensen, Howard Tabor, and Paul Sagers. And they came and they evaluated the collection to determine whether it should be purchased for the sum of $2,000. Lock, stock, and barrel. I mean, you took it all or you took nothing. And they decided, they reported that many items would have been of interest to us. The uniforms of Civil War, all kinds of uniforms. Swords, flags from Jackson County units that fought in the Civil War. Hundreds and hundreds of arrowheads and other Native American artifacts that have been found around here in Jackson County. And they had so many because the local residents were eager to donate them. They wanted to have their discoveries and their names in this museum, and it was a famous museum. It was started, the Ellisonian was started about the same time that the Smithsonian Institute, the Smithsonian museums were started in Washington, D.C. about the same time. We know that J.W. Ellis corresponded with the people at the Smithsonian Institute. They worked together, and in the beginning, they were kind of on equal par. This was, I think it's hard for us to realize, but this was actually a very, very well-known around the world and famous museum. Barb, please, please.
I know in what I read the Smithsonian were so impressed that they allowed him to put the Smithsonian on the back of the Ellis part.
Oh, thank you for that. I didn't see that, but that's impressive. But we should not underestimate the importance of this Ellisonian Museum. Even though it had some shrunken heads and some really strange things, there were wonderful, wonderful treasures in there. And I don't understand, you know, hindsight is wonderful, so forgive me. I don't understand why they couldn't have found a way. They couldn't have found a way to have kept those things in Jackson County. We know that there were artifacts from the Bellevue War, all the Civil War flag. They were just things that just belonged here. Well, according to Lucille, the thing that really influenced their decision was there were a large collection of what I call stuffed birds in glass cases, and that's because Frank was a taxidermist. He had all kinds of exhibits. And the committee was told by some that these were old. They were full of formaldehyde, because that's what they used back then. Joanne Cabin tells us that the two-headed cat in the museum was preserved with arsenic powder, because that's what they did back then. Can't do those things now, but they were told that when these cases were opened, that these birds were just going to go poof, and there'd only be a pile of dust and feathers that would remain. So they thought that some of their money would be wasted. I don't know. I can't explain it, because I don't understand it, and it makes me so sad. But, okay, back to Francis. Francis would not offer to sell it in pieces. He would not let us selectively take what we wanted. And as you see here, on Wednesday, September 21st, 1966, this world-renowned collection, and it was, left the county and left the state. And Clark Garrett of West Elkton, Ohio, and Lawrence King of Monroe Center, Illinois, purchased the items they purchased this whole block of items that they would have sold to us for $2,000 for $5,000. And Francis Ellis of Rockport, Illinois, sold it to them. So the plan was to have 2 auctions across the country. We have a lot of paperwork about this. They were going to be auctioned in Delaware, Ohio, and Richmond, Indiana. And I think that maybe there only ended up being 1 auction. I haven't been able to prove that. But, you know, again, how do we let this happen? We know now that even the rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee were there. One of those rifles alone now brings thousands and thousands of dollars. And all of the Indian artifacts. So anyway, they made the decision and things went away. Well, afterwards, maybe, you know, people were sorry. We wished we hadn't done that, maybe, I don't know. But they made a lot of attempts to locate the collection. I mean, they knew a lot of it went to auction, but maybe not all of it. And it especially all kind of bubbled up again because some Maquoketans were traveling. 2 couples of Maquoketans were traveling in the east. And they came back all excited, and in a large building, a large skyscraper in the basement, when they were touring this building, they reportedly saw huge wooden crates, which were marked Ellisonian Museum, Maquoketa, Iowa. And so when we tried to, and I'd come here by then, we tried to find out what that was, where that was, but nobody could remember exactly what building, exactly where that was. And so once again, we weren't able to find anything out. There was something called Catalog Frank Ellis Museum. No copies of that can we find, but it cataloged everything that had been in the museum. That would be wonderful for us to know whether a certain item was actually in the museum, whether it had been sold ahead of time, etc., etc. But we have never been able to find a copy of that catalog. I don't know, maybe you remember, we had when all this was occurring, we had a brown bag lunch where we talked about the 8 rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee. Those are now in the hands of private collectors who paid thousands of dollars for each of them. We know that they were in the Ellis Museum for a time. And part of what we know is because they had tags on them, they were taken from the bodies of the braves that had died in the battle. They were sent back to the Springfield Arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, where they were curated, and then they went to the Rock Island Arsenal. We know that J.W. Ellis, because he was a very influential man, was able to get 8 of those rifles for his museum here in Maquoketa. And we know that those 8 rifles, and maybe 8 in addition, ended up on the circuit, ended up traveling the country in gun shows, etc., for sale. We know this because as the people bought them, they had tags on them that said Ellisonian Museum, Maquoketa, Iowa. And so what did these new owners with their special guns, they wanted to know more about them, right? Well, we're the only museum in Maquoketa right now, so they all contacted us wanting more information because that would make their artifact more valuable. But, you know, so we know those were out there. Another thing that really impacted, I think I have these on order. Another thing that happened that really impacted us directly. So if you see the first picture, this is the sword of Captain Drips, who was our most famous Civil War hero, perhaps. And this was Captain Drips and Lieutenant Kelsey were both given swords engraved on the hilt. It said, from the people of Maquoketa. They were given these when they went off to war. Captain Drips died on the battlefield at Pea Ridge, Arkansas, and Lieutenant Kelsey died later on in the war. He stepped up to take charge, but he was later wounded. He died later in the war. But both of the swords were eventually returned to the widows, right? The widows donated them on the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Pea Ridge. The widows donated them to the GAR, here in the local unit here in Maquoketa. And we know that from the GAR, they went to the Ellisonian Museum. And so we know that they were there and they ended up on the circuit. Well, luckily, and providentially maybe, the United States Park Service eventually tracked down the Captain Drip sword. They purchased it for a lot of money, I'm sure, and it is displayed in the visitor center on the battlefield at Pea Ridge, Arkansas. Years went by, and then all of a sudden, the Captain Kelsey sword appeared, and that happened because of the rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee. One of the men from Salt Lake City, named Tommy Haas, who had contacted us about his rifle that he bought, was at a huge gun show in Las Vegas at the big convention center. Thousands and thousands of them. And he was looking through things and he spotted this sword and he read on it, from the people of Maquoketa. And he thought, Maquoketa, Maquoketa, I know that name. But he went back to Salt Lake and he figured it out and he called and he said, do you know anything about a sword? You know? And so he went back to Salt Lake, he bought this sword, in the red. He bought that sword for us. He shipped it back to Maquoketa, and you know, what are the odds? What are the odds that that sword would ever make it back to Maquoketa? That sword that was in the Ellisonian Museum. So, I don't know, funny things happen. So, the Ellis Museum, it just grew rapidly. After the Ellisonian closed and everything moved to the Ellis, everything grew rapidly. And one thing that they did, and I put this old newspaper ad in here, is both men had promoted their museums by putting articles in the newspaper, okay? And in the newspaper it would say, oh, so-and-so donated this wonderful flint, whatever, to the museum. Because it was such a famous museum, they wanted their name in there. And it was a good thing. It promoted the museum because then people flocked in to look at these things. It promoted the museum. But the other thing it did was it kind of gathered things together, right? People didn't just put them in a drawer somewhere and forget about them and they just kind of be lost. So it was a good thing. But in reading these stacks of, and we don't even have them all yet, but we're working on it, these stacks of articles about things that were donated there, it's just eye-opening. So we have to credit Don Wentworth with some of these because, you know, he reads the old newspapers and he would print out every time he'd come across one of these for us. There was a regular feature in the Maquoketa Record during 1896 to 1900, and each paper had a column, and it stated the new relics that the museum had received. And also we have a wonderful old scrapbook. You know how back in the day people clipped things out and they pasted them in a wallpaper book or whatever they could find? Well, we have one of those that's just page after page after page of newspaper clippings all about donations to the museums. Now this is what Bill Green wants to say, because he wants to look at these and see what clues he can find about the Seeberger Cave that might have been taken out of there before the 100-year-ago excavation. The problem with the old scrapbook was when they clipped out the things, they didn't say the name of the paper, and they didn't put the date on it. So it's just row after row of articles, fascinating things, but it would take forever to go back and try to figure out, you know, where they were in the paper to see if you could find more. So it was just all pretty interesting, but it's fascinating to read them, and they used it for advertising. It was good for them. Each of the little paragraphs, or however, would say the Ellisonian Institute is open to visitors from 1 to 4 each day, Sundays accepted. Admission was 10 cents. Then later, as you maybe saw on the tickets, the prices went up to 25 cents. But I thought it might be fun to just look at a few of those so we can see maybe what was taken in there. I don't know how Bill Green is going to figure out, by looking at all these things, what may have come from the Seeberger excavation, but he thinks there's a way and he has a plan. So we're going to help him out as best we can. So again, the Ellis museums were there before 1926 when this took place. Frank dug there 3 years before. For 3 years he was in and out of this cave digging. And would you not think that everything he found would have gone to his father's museum? You would think. So for instance, in April 14th of 1927, there was an article in the Bellevue Herald-Leader. Because, you know, people would take these things home, and sometimes they would keep them for a while before they donated them to the museum. But the Bellevue paper reported that someone from New Mexico had sent Frank a live desert cactus. So there were just a variety of things, but mixed in are just some really interesting things. Louisa Clark brought in a fine flint spear with deep serrated edges, or what was called a sawtooth spear, that is a very rare specimen. And then he talks about A.A. Hurst of the Hurstville Lime Kilns. Many donations from him. In one of them, he called Frank up and informed him that Elmer Waters had found a wonderful piece of work of the Aborigines, it being a polished stone pestle with a sharp top which is different than any of the tools yet found around here. And he said it was loosened from the top of a bluff by a blast when they were working at the lime kilns, and Mr. Waters found it after the explosion when everything, you know, fell down to the bottom. There it was. And so many things were found in the Hurstville area. We know that there were burial grounds there. We know that there was a lot of activity there. So I think that's the last one I have. Okay, so donations were coming in strong. In October 16th of 1930, Frank had built his new museum, and he said the building is filling up fast. Frank and Harry Pogman of South Bellevue made a great find by the way of an old Indian burial ground of the times of white men. The burial was at the time undoubtedly that the great Chief Black Hawk's tribe, and they could tell that by the material that the skeletons were wearing. Were of white man's make. The male of the group had been buried in a U.S. coat, and of course it had disintegrated away, but had brass buttons, and one of the buttons had an eagle, and on the back of each of the buttons it stated that they were of superior triple gilt. One button had a small piece of blue cloth still on it. In this area that they found this, there were a great quantity of glass trade beads, 3 parts of clay pipes, a brass buckle, an ornament, an iron hook, and among the beads was an American dime with a hole in it, and that dime was dated 1823. Each one of the 3 skeletons that they found there had an iron bracelet on their wrist. And these materials are now an exhibit in the large skeleton case at the Ellisonian Museum. Another one was May 3rd of 1838. 2 pieces of wood are especially valued by the local collector because other museums have been unsuccessful in finding similar specimens. Embedded in these pieces of wood are the bones of Indians who were buried within the tree and remained undiscovered until the trees were sawed for lumber recently, because the trees would eventually grow around them. And then when they cut the trees, sometimes they would find the skeletons in the trees. So many things happened here. In the museum, we know from these articles, we know that there was a trunk that Abraham Lincoln had once sat on. Well, you know, maybe that's not such a big deal, but over the trunk hung a Union flag, and it was made for Captain A.M. Phillips from here, grandfather of Ben Phillips, by the women of the now vanished city of Cottonville. The banner was borne throughout more than a dozen major battles of the Civil War, including Vicksburg, Mission Ridge, and Lookout Mountain. All those things are not here anymore that were here, and it just hurts my heart. There were a lot of articles that weren't dated and the papers weren't named. One of them, I wondered if Pat Jett knew. Mrs. Mary Teeple brought in a sword that's 113 years old. This sword had been in her family for 77 years. It was owned by Peter Weirden of the 31st Iowa Infantry Company F, who was the father of Mrs. Teeple. And she took his sword in to this famous museum. Robert Porter donated an old Indian papoose carrier that is made of willow and artificial papoose that had been installed in it. Must have a doll in it, which makes it an outstanding attraction for the Indian display. John Wilms, these are all names that we know, donated an old wooden pump with a wooden cylinder that was over 80 years old. Dale donated a large earthen jug that his grandfather had purchased from Ansel Briggs. This adds to the museum's large display of Briggs specimens. Not here anymore. To close, so, you know, a quote from Bill Green's scientific paper, and his book is here on the desk if anybody would like, yes, if anybody would like to look at it. I'm going to try to get more. I assume we can get more. But he says toward the end of his book, to recap our study, Beloit College's one-off foray into Iowa cave archaeology produced interesting but frustrating results. The 10-week Seeberger Cave dig helped launch the career of Paul Nesbitt, who we saw, bolstered Frank Ellis's claim that local caves were worthy of study because it was Frank Ellis who got Beloit to send supposedly a team here to excavate this cave. Other things happened. Some of them went to France, some of them went, so only one man came here to do this cave. And it generated a collection that has remained mostly intact since 1926. So he felt, Bill Green, felt that it was maybe a blessing that all these things went to Beloit College in 1926, that way they all stayed together, they didn't get scattered, and now there are whole new methods of dating things and understanding things, and so the investigation has yielded a lot more of the things that came out of the cave. And then he said, yes, the Ellis Museum collection disappeared, and the Beloit collection rested unused for 80 years, but we have lifted the site, the Seeberger site. We have added to the data about Native Americans' use of Iowa caves and rock shelters, and we also allowed the long overdue reinterment of 2 individuals whose remains were found in the cave, not just in compliance with state and federal law, but also in recognition of their essential humanity. So when they did their dig, they only found 2 skeletons because all of the rest supposedly had been taken away earlier. And they were able to treat them with respect. He said, we have discussed the site's contribution to regional archaeology, but so much more can be learned. And then he went on to say how important private museums like the Ellisonian and the Ellis Museum and the Sagers Museum and maybe our museum, how important these collections are. They're called legacy collections. And he said, we acknowledge and honor the investigators, and Paul Sagers is certainly one of those, whose efforts generated this material by reawakening these collections. They are needed, and they must continue to be accessible for research. So, some of the others we could name, who are some of the ones that you can think of? Arnold Kyle, right, over in Bellevue, had a huge collection. That too went to auction, right, Nancy?
No, I think it was sold, some of it was sold privately. Dennis still has some of them, I think.
Okay, well, I know that Gene Kiefer and a couple of guys bought some of the things at the auction and donated them back to our museum so that they wouldn't leave Jackson County. Gene Kiefer has done a lot of, he's an amateur archaeologist, but he's working on his degree little by little by little. One of the things that Bill Green said in his book is that Paul Sagers learned his love from archaeology, sorry, his love of archaeology because he was young then and he was around when this cave was being, and he worked with Paul Nesbitt a little bit and these people, and that's how he got started. So there's just so many people who have contributed. Everybody in these articles that we're talking about who have found something and donated it has made it, just valuable to everything. And so he's asking that we keep searching here, that we continue to be part of this. And they're not here, but we can look at what we have. If we look through the catalogs of the Sagers Museum, for instance, a lot of these things went to the Sagers Museum. Paul Sagers found a lot of these things, and I don't know how they put those pieces together, but he seems confident that they can with their various testing, that they're going to, that what they've discovered at the Seeberger Cave so far, he says is only scratching the surface. They will go back again, hopefully, by examining all of these little private museums and things like that. They will look for clues that will take them further and further. So he thinks that there's a whole lot more to be discovered about the Seeberger Cave. How many people know where the Seeberger Cave is? It's out by Fulton, and Barb knows. So is it? And we were asking, was that Stephanie? Was that a Seeberger farm at one time?
I went back and looked at my old feed,
Thank you.
and they did own it at the time.
The Seebergers owned it at the time of the excavation in 1926.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I have the old feed and it has all those names on it, because I wondered why it was called Seeberger Cave.
Okay.
We always just called it the Indian Cave.
The Indian Cave. Okay.
I didn't know it was Seeberger Cave until they came like 3 years ago.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts that come to your mind that you learned while they were here, or things that we don't know?
I don't know, I just thought it was really interesting how they found out that that charcoal that they found in that cave was balsam fir, and it doesn't grow around here.
Right.
And then it had to be transported here from probably hundreds or more miles away. And it, was probably used for ceremonial. I always felt that was kind of a special place. There's an overlook up there that I always thought, if I was an Indian years ago, this is where I would have sat and watched the river and thought about this. But it's just a cool spot.
Awesome. So what she's talking about, and I haven't read all that book, but it's pretty fascinating. But he does talk about the balsam fir that they found. So they examined the fire pit, right? And they were able to determine that that's what was burned there. And like she said, didn't grow around here. So they now believe that different tribes met together, that was a special place where many different tribes came together for rituals, whether they were religious ceremonies, whatever they came together for some reason and met there, and they had to bring this special wood with them, because it didn't grow here. And so they just put together this book is full of fascinating things that they were able to put together just for something like some ashes that they found in a fire pit. So he also, I remember reading that the floor of the cave he was sad that the floor of the cave was kind of desecrated, and that's because it's such a large cave that cattle would be in and out of there all the time, and of course, tear up the floor over the
Our
years.
neighbors used to rent that before we had it, and they had cattle.
And they had
said
cattle.
they'd go in there in the summertime and.
To keep
Of course-
cool, I bet.
Yeah, and away from the flies.
Oh, away from the flies, that's a good point.
But then, of course, the manure, but now it's all decomposed, you'd never know it's manure.
Yeah, sure.
But,
So it's just really good. So what's the
yeah.
secret?
Another layer of dirt and stuff to dig through it,
Sure. All right. So would it have been Otto's farm? Do we
That
know?
would have been,
You know
he was
what,
a child,
He would have been a child on that farm.
father's farm.
His father, Otto Seeberger's father's farm.
Yes.
And he came on the orphan train.
Otto did,
Otto came on the orphan train, so we've talked about him before. He and his sister
yes.
came on the orphan train.
Yeah.
And went
Adopted
to
by the Seabird. He
Went
was-
to a Norwegian
He was
Dubuque.
Edinger, Arthur Edinger.
That's right. His real name, they found out, was Arthur Eddington.
Yeah. Came out of New York City.
Okay, so that would have been the farm. Anybody have anything else to add, I hope? Anything that you've heard, anything that you remember? I did, as I was going through the stuff, I did find a letter that Lucille Sorensen had written to me a long time ago that I don't remember, but talking about going to the Ellisonian Museum when she was just a small child, and what she remembered seeing there, and that sort of thing. And I think that she wasn't listed as one of the people on the committee, her husband was, but she wasn't listed. But she does talk about the fact that there was paperwork, and if showing what was there and what they were talking about and that sort of thing. And she guaranteed that if she had gotten one of those, we would still have a copy of it. But they didn't make a copy for everybody, and so nobody has a copy. But one thing I think we need to do, we need volunteers. One thing I think we need to do is we need to look at all of the things that have been donated by the Saviors Museum, because obviously some of these things went there. And then a lot of the Ellisonian things, do you know, Charlie, a lot of the things from the Ellisonian Museum went to Paul's Museum, right?
Well, he took donations from all over.
From everywhere.
But when he died, 16,000 pieces went to the state archaeologists, so as far as,
Who was Bill Green?
right,
Yeah.
right, so, granddad he really felt things needed to stay here.
He wanted things to stay here,
Because he
Saviors.
knew how things get
Right. But
spread out.
yeah, but I understand that a lot of things that went to Iowa City and were very carefully curated. And so everybody knows Paul Sagers's collection was not the largest, you correct me if I'm wrong, not the largest collection of Indian artifacts ever donated, but it was the one they chose to use, and it became the medium for all Native American studies in the Midwest because it was so well documented. Because even though he was an amateur archaeologist, he so carefully documented exactly how deep he found that arrowhead and exactly how far away it was from. His records were so wonderful that they were able to use that as a basis for their studies. And so we should be so proud of Paul Sagers and the museum and the things that they have done.
I've got a copy of one of his journals. He would go
Do
in
you?
during the day and come home at night. He would sketch and leave those details in the journal. But he had some really good mentors, and
Sure.
Ellis was one of them that taught him how to keep those good records.
Right.
Yeah, I heard it called the second most important collection in the state because of that. It helped
Because of the-
establish the timeline. Most of those artifacts were 6,000 and 8,000 years.
Years old,
So there's a lot of shelters and caves and things that
everywhere.
are now just silted in, and we may not realize
Right.
that they're even there. It might look like just a small shelter, but you can take out 10 feet of dirt, and
Right.
it becomes a huge cave. So a lot of those are just filled in, those great floods and things over the years.
Sure.
That fill those up. So a lot of those artifacts are still waiting
Waiting to be found.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's part of what Bill Green is trying to tell us, that, you know, so far they've just discovered the tip of the iceberg, but if we all get to work and help and look through our old records and our old papers and our, just for the tiniest clues, and maybe we just copy and send to him, he's the one that has to see it, because probably we wouldn't know, right? But anyway, he says that we have yet to play a large part in this, so I'm just letting you know that. So, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.